Is Donald Trump really going to provide Patriot missiles, the Patriot missile system, to Ukraine? Is NATO going to be able to fight a conventional war with Russia if they attack in the next year? And what effect are the drone strikes in deepest Russia having, especially against the wildberry warehouses throughout Russia? Hi, I'm David D'Abato, and this is the No Delusion Zone for Friday, July 31st, 2026. And to discuss that and many, many more related topics is my very special guest, Tim Ash. So without further ado, Tim, welcome back. And Tim was here, but he faded out, and now he's back, which I'm really glad. So welcome back, Tim.
Hey, yeah, good to be here. Sorry, I had a bit of a tech problem. I pressed the wrong button on my screen. So,
well, that happens. I completely sympathize with you. But in any event, we discussed off the air what we're going to be talking about. I want to open with your most recent piece, I believe, in your Substack, which is titled "The Writing on the Wall for Putin in D.C." And basically, it talks about how recent events, not the least of which was the sudden, unexpected death of Senator Lindsey Graham, who was a staunch supporter of Ukraine, and how that has possibly, in my opinion, has positively affected the U.S. Congress into supporting Ukraine again after America pretty much shut off the spigot for Ukraine for quite a while. But before we get into that, I want to talk, just briefly mention this, and hopefully you can tie this all together. As I said in the intro, President Trump, is America actually going to provide the Patriot missile, the licensing for the Patriot missile systems to Ukraine that he promised just a few days ago? Because there are stories now going around on many different media platforms that, and I'll quote just one from the Kyiv Post: Trump is still not sure about granting Patriot production license to Ukraine. So true to form, Trump can say one thing and the next moment he could change his mind and flip-flop. So I don't know what's going on there. But before we get to that, I do want to talk about your piece that I just talked about, which is how the writing on the wall, or the U.S. Congress, has changed their sentiment from giving nothing to throwing their support again to Ukraine. Is that a real thing? Do you think it's a temporary blip just because of the death of Lindsey Graham? Or what are your thoughts on this, Tim?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, it relates to the sanctions bill that's been around for a year or so, right? I mean, that's the Lindsey Graham, I think it was Blumenthal, the other US lawmaker who was behind it. I mean, it's been bubbling away for a long time. Seems to be going nowhere. But suddenly, I guess on the back of Lindsey Graham, that there's been some momentum to try and get that on the statute book. I mean, the reality is that the law has been so revised and watered down over the last year to basically, give most of the executive authority over potentially tightening sanctions on Russia to Trump. Right? I remember the original bill, the 500% tariffs on Russia, or Russian countries that import Russian energy, was going to be a bit Katza-like. That's the countering America's adversary through sanctions legislation. Remember that hooked the Turks on when they bought S-400s. So the prior assumption, I think, was to take actually the decision making away from Trump and make it a congressional kind of instituted action. But actually, over the last year, they've kind of changed it, and now basically, it looks fairly aggressive, like 100% tariff on the five biggest importers of Russian energy. I mean, 100% tariff would essentially stop Russian exports. But if it's Trump making the decision, really, I guess what we've learned in the first term and certainly this term of Trump's presidency, he's not that tough on Russia in reality, right? He hasn't done that much to penalize Russia for its actions in Ukraine, and I think many people would assume also with this new legislation, Trump will basically hold back, pull his punches on Putin. I guess the one plus from it perhaps is that it might give Trump some ammunition to, if he's going into negotiations with Putin. Certainly as I've written in various pieces, the noose seems to be tightening around Putin, right? I mean, Ukraine's, on the battlefield, certainly, they're having more success. They've stabilized the front line significantly. The meat grinder's still working. Russia's struggling now. In terms of recruitment, more lives lost than Russians recruited. The mid and deep strike drone attacks are having, a significant effect on Russian logistics train, on its energy supply chains, etc., and have an impact on the Russian population. And the question is, where is the way out for Putin? And hopefully, with more pressure, Putin can be forced to the negotiating table. I mean, if that is the case, then perhaps this latest sanctions package, would be a tool a weapon in Trump's armory if he wanted to go into negotiations and force Putin to make concessions around those negotiations. But I wouldn't hold my breath particularly on Trump playing hardball and using this legislation to actually hurt Russia very much. And I guess the problem there is Putin probably thinks the same as I do, right? I mean, probably Putin's thoughts are that in the end he can play Trump, right? He can play Trump. Trump in the end, taco. Trump always bottles out one way or another. So, I'm not sure this legislation necessarily is a game changer. I mean, the mood music certainly around Zelensky's visit to DC this week was certainly better than February 2025 with the ambush in the Oval Office. And certainly in terms of the MAGA movement, there's been a significant change in terms of how Ukraine is now perceived in the MAGA media. Obviously, Laura Loomer was in Kiev last week, quite remarkably, almost a mea culpa from her in terms of apologizing for a past manipulation by the Russian propaganda machine, and suggesting that she's now supportive of Ukraine. And there seems to be a change in general in the MAGA establishment around that. And I think, and also with Trump, I mean, he seems, much more amenable to the Ukrainian view. I mean, I think the change is just a fact of the reality. Trump seems to like winners. He made that assumption early on, well, in his first term, and probably, in this term anyway, that Russia was the inevitable winner, forced the weaker hand Ukraine to make concessions and make peace and friends with the Russians and whatever. I think now the Ukrainians, by their own actions, right, by their their innovation and bravery, the fact that they've turned they seem to have turned the cycle of the war in their favor. It now looks like Russia has no winning strategy. It's only going to get worse for the Russians. Trump's team seems to have realized that. And if anything, the more likely scenario is of a Russian collapse. And I mean, from Trump's perspective, when, he's struggling a bit in terms of foreign affairs, obviously stuck in Iran, stuck in the Iran war. He needs a win. I mean, imagine a scenario where, because of Ukraine's actions, Russia does collapse. The Russian war machine collapses. They're forced to do a deal with Ukraine, or, the Putin administration itself collapses, right? I mean, Trump would, try and steal that victory from the Ukrainians, I would say, and try and sell himself as a modern day Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher with the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? So I think there's a bit of that going on, that he's I'm going to say almost an ambulance chaser, but he's smelling a winning hand from Zelensky, and he wants to take that hand over in a way.
I mean, I agree with everything you're saying. It's just that with Trump, as you well know, he changes, from minute to minute, and it depends not even what the facts are on the ground. It depends on how he feels at the moment, whether or not his Big Mac was done to his satisfaction, or, or his fries were crispy enough. I mean, literally, it's that ridiculous. What kind of a mood he's in, or if he got enough sleep, or if he's didn't sleep enough during the day during his meetings, he'll change his mind. Again, I want to ask because the U.S. Congress, as well as every other institution of my government, has just been a total failure. Since the second Trump inauguration last year. And I still think that if circumstances change, or if Trump just comes on stronger or whatever, that they are going to bend to his will. I pray that their support for Ukraine and the sanctions packages that are being proposed now against Russia do in fact stand, and that this is the new future. I just don't believe it, and I can't count on it. Again, do you think that there's enough sentiment within the U.S. Congress to go against Trump if he were to change his mind again and decide to to kiss and make up with Putin and withdraw any or all support for Ukraine? Do they have enough people, especially in the Republican Party, to stand up against him?
Well, you're right there. I mean, it's interesting that at the NATO summit, Zelensky seemed to get an agreement about licensing to produce Patriot missiles in Ukraine, right? And I think the visit this week was to cement that. I think Zelensky even had meetings organized with US producers of Patriots, and then suddenly Trump seems to have changed the narrative a little bit. If you remember, over the past week also with the Saudi nuclear deal, remember that if you read the text from the US Department of Energy, there's no mention of the Abraham Accords in that text, right? And then suddenly after the event, Trump seemed to change the narrative, suggesting that the deal was the Saudi was going to get that access to US nuclear technology, but only on the condition that they normalize with Israel. I think Trump was clearly lobbied after the event in terms of that particular agreement, and maybe it's the same with the Patriots. Maybe the Russian interests have been lobbying behind the scenes, and Trump, has reacted to that. Look, I think something has changed, though. I mean, the question is whether Ukraine should rely on the US or rely on the US Congress. I think in a way we've moved beyond that, right? I mean, now Ukraine is almost in charge of its own destiny, right? And interestingly, there's been another development, really interesting development over the past week or so. It's Ukraine's deep strikes against the CPC, which is the Kazakh Pipeline Consortium, which is really interesting from many respects, because people are asking how is this happening? Because basically this is Kazakh oil transported on a pipeline with, it's a consortium of Western energy companies, and the oil is exported to Europe as a diversification ploy against Russia in a way. So you'd think, why would the Ukrainians be hitting that? Well, I think they're hitting it because one, they can, they have the capability. Two, I think the Kazakhs, I don't think, have done enough not to avoid helping the Russians in terms of dual use technology. I think the Ukrainians certainly want to close off the Novorossiysk port in general, which is where the CPC terminal is based. But I think also they want the Kazakhs to do more to pressurize the Russians to come to a peace deal. I think they want the Europeans also to put more pressure in general. I mean, Ukraine is basically taking the initiative here. It's saying that we're going to do everything in our interests. And if that has an impact on global energy markets, well, you guys need to do what you've been doing in the Gulf and find alternatives, like the Chinese basically reducing consumption. They've obviously got that big energy reserve, and maybe it's also a bit about forcing Chevron, which is one of the big CPC partners, to lobby the Americans or the US administration to come through on those Patriots, right? So again, the Ukrainians have the ability now. They're not reliant anymore on US, ATACMS or HIMARS or British Storm Shadow or French Scalp missiles to hit the Russians. They can hit them with their own capability, right? So they don't have to ask permission to hit the Russians. but basically they're taking, the initiative themselves, and they're saying, we act in our interests. The US launched the war with Iran, not in Europe's interest, because basically it put, energy prices high. Europe's and Asia's big energy importer. US was acting in its own interest. And I think the Ukrainians said, well, we're going to do the same, right? Our interest is hitting Russian energy assets and associated assets, and you guys need to do more to help us. And again, going back to this idea that if Chevron wants the CPC to continue, it needs to persuade Trump and his friends in Washington to release. What the Ukrainians obviously need is air defense capability, and they're running short on Patriots, right? So that's the deal, right? I mean, Ukraine will stop hitting those ships, looking to dock at CPC and load oil, but the Chevron and US interests have to make sure that Ukraine gets its Patriots, right?
Correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't it the Kazakh president who just dressed down Putin in a press conference, basically said, what is this war for? It's not for us. And basically something that would never have been said until very, very recently by a former Soviet satellite to the Russian president. Yes?
Absolutely. And I think it was linked to CPC, right? I mean, the hits on CPC, right? I mean, 80% of Kazakh exports of oil go through the CPC, right? There is no alternative, right? They can't divert the oil somewhere else. It's a $3 billion hit a month to Kazakhstan. So I think in making those comments to Putin, I mean, I think Tokayev was mindful that, the Ukrainians have leverage over Kazakhstan, and it's a good thing all around if the Kazakhs and their friends persuade Putin to come to the negotiating table. It was interesting that that speech was in Omsk in Russia, and it was made at a press conference in public, and it was a humiliation for Putin. I mean, I don't think Tokayev would have done it unless his back was held or propped up by either the Americans or the Chinese or both, right? I think probably the Chinese. I think probably Xi now is of the view that that probably there are greater risks now for Russia by the extension of this war than not cutting a deal now, right? And I think the Chinese are mindful of a scenario where Russia suffers a catastrophic defeat, and what the implications that would be for Russia in terms of the survival of the Federation. I mean, it's not necessarily my base case, right? But you're old enough, as I am, to remember the collapse of the Soviet Union. I was in Moscow in August '91 at the collapse of the Soviet Union, and no one expected it, right? And actually, people like the IMF, etc., were all lobbying for it not to happen, right? So things can happen fairly quickly, right? So I think the Chinese are a little bit nervous about direction of travel with this war now. Yeah. They don't see a path to Russian victory. I don't see a path to a victory for Russia anymore. And the longer it goes on, the worse it's going to get for Russia, and the greater risks, I think, for the Russian economy and political stability and geopolitical stability across the region, right? So hence why Tokayev made such an extraordinary statement to Putin, right? I remember, if you go back early 22, Tokayev himself, I mean, he faced a coup attempt or, significant domestic social unrest. He's described that subsequently as a coup attempt, but he was basically bailed out by CSTO forces, which were Russia bailed him out in 2022. And despite that, you'd probably think he would be, somewhat feeling some kind of dependency on Russia. Despite that, I think now even Tokayev feels brave enough to come out and lobby Putin very publicly to bring an end to this war. So I think that's really, really significant, right? Tokayev understands Russia, right? I mean, Tokayev is no fool. He understands Russia. He understands, the pressures that are building up in the Russian economy. There are significant implications there for Kazakhstan itself, obviously felt through the CPCs. But for Tokayev to feel empowered enough or minded enough to do something like this, I think is quite extraordinary, and shows what the mood music and sense is around Russia by the Chinese, by the Central Asians, etc. I mean, Russia is facing, Putin is now facing a very, very difficult situation because of his war in Ukraine and because of what the Ukrainians have been able to achieve, largely without the support of the Americans, right? I mean, it's extraordinary that, Trump came to power, cut financial aid to the Ukrainians, limited intelligence and military supplies to the Ukrainians apart from what was bought by the Europeans. And the Ukrainians have turned that around to their advantage, right? And now they have the impetus in this war. They have lots of cards. They're number one in terms of drone technology. We obviously now understand the importance of drones in modern warfare, given the war in Ukraine, but also the war in the Middle East, right? So Ukraine now calls a lot of the shots, right?
You mentioned China most likely backing, what Tokayev said, and I agree with you. You know better than I do that the Chinese, as aggressive as they are, they're all for stability. They don't want to rock the boat, the international system. They are thriving from that. So what Russia's doing in Ukraine really isn't in their best interest at all. So, I can see them backing Kazakhstan. The other thing that's not never, but rarely mentioned, and I want to just ask you about this. Kazakhstan is the host country to the Russian Cosmodrome. All the space shots that go out for Russia, and before that, the Soviet Union, are in Kazakhstan. To me, I would think that's some leverage over Moscow. What do you think?
Yeah, but I'm not too sure about that. I mean, the Kazakhs probably are still very nervous about all the Central Asians. I mean, they've played a very delicate game, right? I mean, they certainly don't want a Russian victory in Ukraine. Their view is that if Russia succeeds in rolling out a new version of the Soviet Union and retaking control over the near abroad, they're next, right? And obviously, there's a large ethnic Russian population congruous to the Russian border in Kazakhstan that they worry that Russia ultimately will annex northern Kazakhstan, right? I mean, they're concerned about that. And militarily, I mean, there's no way the Kazakhs could hold off the Russians, even in the desperate position I guess the Russian military is in after the war in Ukraine. So they're kind of very nervous about that. They play a delicate balance, and obviously they've deepened relations with China, with Turkey, with the Americans as a counter to Russia. And I guess the Chinese backstop now is, has encouraged or emboldened Tokayev to feel able to make those comments to Putin. I don't think the Kazakhs could restrict access to the Baikonur space station to pressurize the Russians to somehow change its actions on Ukraine.
Oh, I don't either, but it certainly could piss off Putin if they even talked about it, and I think that would be great.
Yeah, no, it will be fine, but I think it's quite unlikely. But
they're not going to block it off to Russian use, but the fact that they might even bring it up to him, I think, would be not a bad thing.
Yeah, but as I said, I mean, I think the developments in Kazakhstan this week have been very, very interesting. The CPC comments, it just underlines the difficulties that Russia's in.
I agree. Let me ask you this, and I don't know if this is related or not with Trump's allegedly flip-flopping on the Patriot licensing for Ukraine. A lot of stories recently, the last 24 to 48 hours, have surfaced again about the shortage of U.S. precision munitions. One story I'm reading specifically, it says that nearly the U.S. has used or depleted nearly 67% of their Patriot stockpile. I don't know. What do you think? Because if Ukraine got the license to produce Patriot missiles, which wouldn't still happen for quite a while in the future, I don't see how that's going to affect the drawdown or the depletion of the stockpiles of U.S. Patriot missiles. But we are certainly, meaning the U.S., going through a heck of a lot of them and ATACMS in the Middle East. That's got to be, I don't know. Is that any kind of a decision you think that's at least in Trump's not that literate mind that may make him decide not to give the license to Ukraine for Patriot missiles, or does he even think that far?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of inconsistencies at the moment in US policy more generally. I mean, remember Elbridge Colby, who is the very vocal undersecretary or deputy secretary, I don't know his precise role at the Department of Defense or War or wherever you call it these days. I mean, he's always been banging the drum that the US needs to reduce its footprint in Europe. Europe needs to step up. The main focus for the US is China. And he has been, he prior to the war in Iran, I mean, he was focusing on the munition shortages and challenges for the US in terms of countering China in the Far East, right? And then the US get involved in this war in Iran and deplete their missile stockpiles, almost, to a catastrophic extent, right? That must, it's manna from heaven for the Chinese. I mean, if you're sitting in Beijing, what a wonderful scenario, right? That you waste all these munitions in a futile war in Iran, and they're not going to be available for potentially the defense of Taiwan or the defense of US interests in the Far East. But you're right. I mean, you'd think that the US would have some incentive to speedily replenish those Patriot missile supplies by getting partner countries like Ukraine and perhaps like Europe to produce them. So I don't get it why, all I can think of is that, some of those Russian interests in the US around President Trump have been lobbying to stop the extension of that licensing to produce Patriot missiles in Ukraine. So
why is that, Tim? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think Russian interests are, I think Russia has infiltrated, a lot of the far right movements in the US, right? I think they've used money to corrupt a lot of those social influences. I mean, again, Lara Loomer kind of came out with it this week and was quite open about it. And that's very unfortunate, right? And
well, this is treason. I mean, I'm sorry, and this is the definition of treason. If in fact U.S. Elected representatives were swayed either through money or ideology to support Russia against the United States' best interests.
Well, look, I mean, rival powers have an interest in infiltrating, their rivals' regimes. I mean, the US does it all over the world.
Sure.
What it is, I mean, it's, but we need to, so the US and the UK and countries like that should expect Russia to try to do that. But so we know that they're doing it.
Oh yeah, they have forever.
I guess we are.
Give into it is one. To know it exists is one thing. To actually blatantly give into it with U.S. elected officials is another.
I do find it extraordinary, and that it's not been called out.
No.
And obviously there was the Mueller report, etc. And I mean, mistakes have been made along the way. Certainly. But clearly, for whatever reason, I mean, Trump seems to pull his punches when it comes to Putin, right? And I think we've debated that previously.
Yes.
Obviously, there's been comment that somehow there are some business interests at work there. I think certainly the Trump team, would love to do more business with Russia. I mean, obviously, there was a lot of focus on that with the Dmitriev process with Witkoff and Kushner, this idea of a reverse Nixonian about somehow the US allying with Russia against China. And Russia obviously has lots of raw materials and rare earths and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I get that. But actually, in the way how I make sense of Trump and his kind of unusual kind of affinity with Putin, the way I've described it is, and I don't know, it's just speculating, but I think, Putin does scare Trump. And I think the thing about Putin, you know, and you've covered Russia a long time, so have I. I mean, you know, Putin is a classic mafiosa style character, right? And you know, at the end of the Soviet Union, the early period of the Russian Federation, you know, Russian security services, KGB, kind of merged within the underworld in Russia. The two almost became one, right? And I think Putin is one of those kind of characters, right? Organized crime, mafia, security services, and you know, I think in understanding that, perhaps meeting Putin, Trump perhaps sees a character that he probably would have come across similar characters in his time in New York City in real estate. You know, you had those mafia style characters.
John Gotti, for example. Yeah.
Yes, precisely. And I think he would have understood during that period that you probably don't mess with those characters, right? They probably are life threatening, right? And I think, you know, I think Putin, sorry, Trump, Freudian slip. I think Trump is scared of Putin. I think he's scared of what Putin could personally do to him, right? You know, assassination, whatever it might be. But, you know, I think that's the basis of the fact that Trump, you know, is very careful in terms of how he manages Putin, right? He never takes him on. He's very deferential to him. You know, I know there's been talk about compromat, you know, potential compromat that Russia could have on Trump. You know, I in a way, I don't think, you know, from what we've seen from Trump, I don't think any of that compromat would necessarily stick.
No.
So I don't think
he would use it for positive publicity.
Yeah, I don't think Trump really cares about
that. No, not at all.
He survived the Mueller inquiry and all that.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, there is a fear of Putin about what, you know, this is an evil character that does evil things, that kills people. And I think Trump's mindful of that, and that's how he's reluctant to take Putin on.
Well, you know, the thing that still bothers me about the whole U.S. Congress, anyway, not so much Trump because he's Trump, about not or hesitating about giving the license to Ukraine for producing Patriots or any U.S. weapons, which has been a problem also to pay Ukraine. Or Ukraine to pay the United States for their weapons, is because this is a business transaction. These are deals, as Trump likes to say. Why would the U.S. government under Trump not want Ukraine or Europe to pay for, through the nose, for U.S. produced and designed weapons? That makes no economic sense. Forget national security. And that's still bothers me. The same with this Patriot licensing. They're going to make defense contractors, rather, would make a bundle off of this. There should be no hesitation, but there is.
No, I agree. And actually, in the war in Ukraine, it's been a huge advertisement for Patriot missiles, right? I mean, they have come out, they've far exceeded expectations. They've proven to be really the only consistent defense against ballistic missiles fired from Russia. You know, the appetite and demand for Patriots globally is now huge, right? And, you know, far outweighing S-400s in terms of their capability. So you would think that the interest of the US is to massively increase production of those missiles, right? And again, as I said previously, you know, being produced in Europe by the Ukrainians or the Brits or the French or whatever, right? I mean, look, in the end, if the US does not allow this, we've seen with the Ukrainians or the Turks, they will develop their own equivalents of Patriot missile systems, right? You know, if countries can't get them and the US is not seen as a reliable partner, you know, again, they will make their own, they will be rival.
Tim, isn't that happening? Am I wrong? Is it the Swedes or what other country is on the verge of producing a Patriot-like missile that they're going to sell to Ukraine? Or is it the Ukrainians themselves? I'm not sure. But one of the countries is on the verge of doing that.
Well, I mean, now there's a huge amount of focus. I mean, if you go before the war in Iran, the Ukraine war and then the war in Iran, I guess NATO partners, you know, the US had the Patriot system. It was the best system. I mean, there was a willingness, there was trust in the US. There was a willingness, you know, to default to the US system. And, you know, the US had that comparative advantage, whatever. So the Germans, the Spanish, etc., bought it and maintained these systems, right? I think now, unfortunately, the US is now seen as an unreliable partner, given its machinations around supporting Ukraine, but also developments in Iran. And with the Turks, for example, I mean, the Turks wanted to buy Patriot missile systems. The Americans played hardball. In the end, the Turks went off and bought S-400s, right, and got thrown off the F-35 program. So I know for a fact the Turks Erdogan himself has announced a $24 billion investment in a Turkish steel dome, which is to develop a Turkish version of the Patriot missile system, right? So, I mean, it's going to take some time, but, if you look at what the Turks are doing in terms of drone technology and missile technology as well, right? It looks like it's going to be, I'd say it's quite possible over the medium term for certainly the Turks and other European powers to get something comparable, even better than the Patriot missile system, if we're talking about 4 to 5 years down the line. And that's a huge loss, I mean, to the Americans. I mean, at the moment, the Patriot is a milking cow in terms of a business perspective. Everyone wants to buy it, right? Why would you not? You've got the best product on the market at the moment. Why would you not do everything possible to maximize production, take advantage of that demand while you've got it, and anchor everyone into your system, right? To make it that no one really wants to make an alternative and a rival, right? I mean, I would say that 10 years down the line, the US will face a lot of competition from other countries in lots of those defense lines that it currently has a monopoly in.
For those that don't know, that don't follow this as obsessively as perhaps somebody like me or you, the Patriot missile, as we say, is cost about $4 million per missile and takes upwards of 2 years to produce. And America has apparently not kept up with that, even knowing of the possibility of future conflicts, because the Pentagon war games all the time, as do all countries. They knew that this was a potential shortage. They knew how long the process is to produce and pay for Patriot missiles, and yet here we are. As the report I read just said, we're down 67% have been used of Patriot missiles just in this war with Iran, which is still not a full-fledged war, but it's still draining our precision munitions quite a bit. Patriot missiles have been used in some instances to shoot down $20,000 drones. I just read a story today, and I think it was the Army Times here in the States, about how the U.S. Army is finally upping its game with development of drones, of their own drones, and teaching soldiers how to do that. But they are still so many years behind Ukraine, as well as even some other countries, Russia, China, Iran, that it's just baffling to me. Why is that, though, Tim, in my opinion? Because the defense contractors in this country still hold sway. Why would they want to give up their multi-billion-dollar contracts to produce a $20,000 or $30,000 drone, which many of the components they could get from off the shelf? So that's the situation here with the Patriot system. And yes, the Patriot missile system is still the only system that can shoot down Russian ballistic missiles, but it's being used for other things. So, I just wanted to throw that in because that to me is insane. How far behind the United States is, to the point of being a catastrophe, and we're still not going full speed into producing drones. Forget Patriots. We're not even producing drones or training our own military fast enough to counter the Russian and Chinese and Iranian drones. It's just a disgrace to me.
No, you're right. I mean, I think one reason why we've seen this sea change in terms of opinion around supporting Ukraine, particularly in the US, and in Europe, actually, in terms of the necessity of financing and supporting Ukraine now, is the realization that, Ukraine is it's at the front line, but it's the front line of defense, innovation, technology, right? And our future defense will be dependent on what is being learned in Ukraine now, right? And I mean, you mentioned the the defense primes. I mean, there is this almost this mafia style, you know, I mean, maybe mafia is the wrong word to describe it, but you know, the problem is these old school defense primes are protecting their turf, right? Their dominance in old type military technology, the warships, the tanks, the manned fighter aircraft, right? And those big contracts. But the reality is that the technology and the innovation that's happening, you know, in Ukraine, with Turkey, with drones, you know, they face extinction in a way, right? I mean, things like warships with naval drones. I mean, look at the Black Sea Fleet, the Russian Black Sea Fleet, you know, at the bottom of the Black Sea now. I mean, you know, there's still a lot of very old school thinking in the defense world. And actually, you know, I've written quite a lot about it in terms of there's a lot of focus, and actually Trump's been hailed as this savior of the West in terms of his push to get the West to increase defense spending, you know, from this 2% of GDP to the 3.5% target, and then the 5% all in terms of infrastructure, etc. I think in a way we're looking at the wrong thing, and obviously the defense primes love that. They love the idea that, you know, defense spending is going to go from 2% of GDP to 3.5% and this 5%, right? Because they think they're going to get, you know, lots more warships, lots more tanks and armored personnel carriers and missiles and Patriots. Where actually, the way I think about it is, you know, we should be more than able to defend Europe with a defense budget of 2% of GDP with the use of technology, and drones change that, right? Completely, right? I mean, it was interesting, and I thought somewhat ironic this week that that Zelensky visited the UK, and the new UK Prime Minister Andy Burnham met him on the deck of one of our 2 aircraft carriers. I think it was the Queen Elizabeth, and the UK was trying to signal to Zelensky, you know, how wonderful and advanced and capable the UK military was because it had this huge aircraft carrier. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, that aircraft carrier would probably last half an hour in a modern naval battle with Ukrainian drones, like a bit like the Moskva, right? And it's a sad indictment of the British military establishment that we bought these 2 aircraft carriers and we spent so much money on them that we can't afford to put F-35s on them, and we can't afford the destroyer support vessels to defend the aircraft carriers. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And it's just the way, you know, we need to change our whole mindset in terms of defense, innovation, procurement. And again, 2% of GDP should be more than enough to defend Europe. I mean, you know, you think Europe is a 25 trillion euro economy, 2% of GDP, it's about 500 billion euros. That's still double the amount that Russia spends on defense, right? And we have, you know, the huge, you know, advanced European, you know, manufacturing, innovation, science base. So, you know, we just need to think outside the, well, we don't need to think outside the box. We just need to look at what's happening in Ukraine and how, you know, innovation and drones and all those kind of things are changing the nature of warfare. And we need to, you know, we need to assimilate all those things that have been learned in Ukraine as soon as possible, right? And, you know, the old defense, you know, I'm thinking in the UK, we have, you know, we have this 6th generation fighter jet project, Tempest, which is looking to deliver a 6th generation fighter plane by the middle of the next decade, right? So like 10 years from now. Like, really? All right. I mean, in 10 years from time, do we really know that air warfare is going to be manned with like old platforms? You know, we're committing billions of dollars to that particular program. You know, I would think it'd be much better to kind of cooperate with the Turks. They have an unmanned fighter jet, the Kizemla, that, you know, is making great strides. And again, it just shows how, you know, we say in English half-arsed. I'm not sure you Americans say it. But,
oh yeah.
You know, we're looking at things from completely the wrong perspective.
Yeah.
Right? And you know, it's our national security is at risk. And this idea of, you know, going from 2% of GDP to 3.5% and the 5%, you know, it's not cost-free, right? I mean, you know, if you increase defense spending, you know, we face large budget deficits, lots of public debt. You have to make sacrifices. If you're increasing defense spending, you have to cut welfare spending. There are costs with all of this, right? Trade-offs and costs, and there are no easy decisions. But what is clear is we need to be much more efficient and technology focused and innovation focused.
Well, that's just the key. You can spend all the money on earth, but if you're doing the same thing wrong, you're not going to be able to keep up with your adversaries. And that the proposed budget, which I think is either passed or near passing in the United States for next year, is $1.5 trillion. That still boggles my mind. That's more than I think all of the other militaries in the world combined are spending. And, I consume a lot of information, publications about the U.S. military every day, and we are still designing and building aircraft carriers, jets, next generation jet-manned jet fighters and bombers. And we are spending a minuscule amount of the defense budget on designing and implementing drone warfare and anti-drone warfare. If we spent, I don't know, Tim, $100 billion, 5% of the proposed defense budget just on upgrading and maintaining the current fleets that we have, but spending the remainder on drone warfare, I believe we'd be ahead of the game. What do you think?
No, absolutely. Look, I mean, I get the story, and I've been, one of the proponents of it, that Europe in particular, failed to take the threat from Russia seriously enough, right? I mean, Russia is the existential threat. There was too much, there were too many Putin Vyshtayas, the Putin kind of understanders, whatever you call it, around. And we made strategic mistakes in terms of relationship with Russia. We need to step up our defense. We need autonomous defense. We need to be able to defend ourselves without the US. I mean, that's absolutely clear to me. But I don't think the solution necessarily is just brain dead doubling defense spending, right? Because we'll end up, instead of 2 worthless UK aircraft carriers, we'll probably end up with 4 worthless UK aircraft carriers, if that's the experience of the past, right? We need to understand, what the threat is, what the primary and existential threat to Europe is. It's Russia. And we need to focus our defense spending on countering that threat, and how we do it as quickly as possible. And I think the only way, the only way to counter that threat quickly is not to spend billions on a 6th generation fighter jet that's only going to be delivered 10 years down the line, when the war with Russia will have been already decided, right? We'll already know whether this existential battle, Europe has been successful or not, right? We need to, spend money now on defense tech and innovation, and that looks like it's significantly going to be drone related.
I agree with you. And again, in consuming and reading about all the American military research and development, we are still, as I said, developing and building aircraft carriers. I just read a lengthy piece in the Army Times here about the development of new armored vehicles, both tanks and troop carriers and so forth. Now, you need some of those, but, I don't know. It just makes me crazy. And then a very, very slim article about how they're training a very small amount of soldiers in the United States Army and Marine Corps in drone warfare. And it's just like, and that's just like a side note. Like, that's not the most important thing. What's important to them is we need more tanks. We need more armored vehicles of all kinds. We need more aircraft carriers and destroyers and cruisers and so forth and so on. Next generation aircraft. Let me just say at this point, I think we will need manned aircraft, manned naval vessels for quite some time into the future. I'm not saying we just do away with them, but I'm saying that the lion's share of the defense budget should go to autonomous weapons systems, both in the air, on the ground, and under the sea. Because to develop new fighting weapons platforms now that will not even be fielded until the next decade is ludicrous, because, as you said, you can't project out that far with all the tech developments that are happening today. We may have no manned aircraft or ships, or very little in the near future. Good. Submarines. Yeah, I think we should spend a lot of money on submarines. Those are still cost effective, but aircraft carriers, main battle tanks, manned fighters and bombers, absolutely not. And let me get to one more point here, which will allow us, well, two more actually, to round out the hour. And I said this at the beginning. As you know, Ukraine has been very successfully using long-range sanctions, as Zelensky says, to straighten the attitude, an attitude adjustment for Russia, not only the government, but the Russian people. And this is a new piece here about how the fact that Moscow was so afraid of what's going on now with the drone attacks that they have printed a map about bomb shelters for the Russian people, so they know where to go when they see those pesky Ukrainian drones in the sky. I think that's an excellent development. So I wanted to talk to you about this before I get to the very last point, which is about NATO and their not being prepared for a conventional Russian advance. How seriously, in your opinion, as an economist, are the Russian or the Ukrainian strikes on wild berries and, of course, the gas and oil infrastructure in Russia affecting the Russian economy above and beyond what the sanctions may be doing? Are they for real, or is it just for show?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think this is all about bringing the war home to Russia and Russians. I mean, there's been a lot of comments over the last 4.5 years that despite sanctions, ordinary Russians have not really felt, the impact of the war, right? Unless you're, one of those people in, typically Muslims in southern Russia, who have been the cannon fodder typically for the war in Ukraine. I mean, the million casualties. It's not been people,
or Siberia, yeah,
it's not been people from Moscow and St. Petersburg,
no.
Right? So it's been from the periphery of Russian society, right? But actually, this does bring home the war to Russia, right? And I think both the strikes on refineries. I mean, lots of different calculations, but between 25 and 40% of Russian refinery production taken out of action. We are seeing the impact of that in terms of actual queues at gas stations, as you call them. Queues, higher prices, Russians whinging about that. And I think this, the latest move to attack, internet marketplaces, I think is an act of genius. I mean, let's just think about the impact. I mean, I'm sure. Well, in the US, like the UK, I mean, look at the role of Amazon. Look at how we use Amazon in our everyday lives. And Wildberries is Russia's Amazon, right? So imagine if suddenly there's no Amazon in the US. What does that mean? I mean, it probably means consumers get pretty pissed off because they can't get.
Tim, I agree with you. But before we go any further, I think you'll appreciate this. I want to play a brief clip that's it's not new. It's about a week or two old, but I think you'll love it. It's exactly about what you're talking about and how the brain dead Russians are being affected by this. It's a brief clip, so bear with me.
Просто не могу в этом сумасшествии жить, блин. Я, блин, стояла сейчас в пробку на F9. У меня просто сломалась, блин, машина. Она не заводится. Я не понимаю, как мне открыть капот, блин. Ко мне приходят люди, никто не знает, как открыть, блядь, капот просто. Муж мне говорит, что у меня села батарейка в ключе. Я вот разобрала весь ключ. Я не понимаю, куда здесь ставить батарейку, блин. Уже пропустила просто всю очередь. Я вообще просто не знаю, что мне делать. Мне никто не может не прикурить, не помочь, блин, капот открыть, не помочь разобрать ключ, блин, ставить батарейку. Со мной Мия, которую я разбудила специально в 9 утра, чтобы поехать, блин, заправиться. Просто когда уже все это закончится, я не могу уже больше так.
I couldn't have said it any better.
Yeah, poor girl. Poor girl. But I mean, look, in terms of what it means is at the retail level, it means shortages.
Yes.
It means higher prices. And then, companies use Wildberries like they use Amazon in terms of the supply chain. So it will mean disruption throughout the economy. Again, more shortages. As has been mentioned, I mean, there are many SME, small, medium-sized companies in Russia that use Wildberries. They, either they're retailers or producers or suppliers of these products. Presumably, there's been huge losses suffered in terms of working capital, etc., lost in these warehouse blazers. Who's going to pay for that? If it's Wildberries, that must put the future of the company under threat. Presumably they have loans, etc. If it's the individual companies, again, they'll probably go out of business. Bankruptcies will increase. Non-performing loans in the banking sector will also increase. This will cause, financial ramifications throughout the economy. And ultimately, it means lower growth, higher inflation, a weaker economy. That's good news, right? I mean, and I think a confidence shock, again, this idea, this is about bringing the war home to Russians, that this war is not working. It's having a negative impact. You need to rethink this whole kind of story. And I think, good. I mean, I think it's a genius move by Ukrainians. They will continue to do this kind of thing. It's only going to get worse for Russia and the Russian economy.
I agree. So it's a dual use kind of thing. It's both a psychological effect on the Russian people to show that, hey, you're not safe either. Now you're going to get a taste of what the Ukrainians, just a little taste of what Ukraine's been suffering for 4.5 years. So I agree, and as well as disrupting the economy with the strikes on the energy infrastructure, and then, like you said, in the small, medium businesses that were tied into Wildberries. The last thing I want to touch on today in the few minutes we have remaining is the fact that, as I alluded to at the beginning, the slow development or reaction by NATO to what's going on in Ukraine and what's going on with the Russian military. And there was a new piece here in the Kyiv Post that addresses that, basically saying that NATO won't be ready to repel a Russian conventional attack until 2035. I've done a lot of pieces on this. I've written articles, I've done podcasts, and it's just mind-boggling to me that still the European leaders that belong to NATO, and I'm going to have to say it, they don't get it. They do get it, they don't get it. Why don't they get it? If they got it, they wouldn't say that they won't be ready to repel and this is not just me, the Supreme Commander of NATO, General Grinkowicz, said that NATO will not be probably in a position to successfully repel a Russian conventional invasion until 2035. Again, that's mind-boggling to me. They have the capacity. You just mentioned it. They have the economy and they have the manufacturing capacity to overwhelm any Russian conventional invasion in short order if they wanted to. What they don't have is the political will. And I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, no. Look, yes, I agree. I mean, it's a mixed bag. I would say that within Europe, the Balts understand it, the Finns understand it. I think increasingly the Swedes do, the Germans, the Turks. So there is a backbone for Europe that, Poland is spending 5.8% of GDP on defense now, right? Turkey is a very capable military. The Finns can put like a million soldiers in the field. I mean, they're serious guys. I mean, they're finally waking up to this realization. Germany has awoken, but it'll take the Germans probably 4 to 5 years to roll out its actual defense capability. But I think the silver lining to this for Ukraine is that the realization in Europe is actually there now that Russia is this existential threat, that there is this threat of invasion from Russia. And there's also a recognition that, while they're now increasing defense spending, it's going to take some years to get to that point where they're able to defend themselves. And there's an understanding that, the solution in the short term to the defense is Ukraine. So hence why the Europeans very quickly got finance in place for Ukraine at the end of last year, this $90 billion financing program. There's about another $100 billion to come with its pre-accession money. But Ukraine now is well financed. I think we are finally now seeing Europe reach out to Ukraine for joint defense development, etc. I mean, so look, in the end, the Ukraine, I think in the last 4 or 5 years, always had the innovation edge on drones, right? But it didn't have the financial edge or the scale edge. I think what we've seen with this change in opinion in Europe, realization dawning about the threat from Russia, is they've now given Ukraine the financial resources to give them scale. And we're seeing that now in terms of mid and deep strike drone capability. Ukraine now, I think, is being able to match Russia in terms of production of those longer range strike systems. And I think it's only going to get better for Ukraine and worse for Russia, right? So the tide has turned. There's no way back for Russia, in my mind. The longer the war goes on, the bigger the defeat, and the more catastrophic the defeat for Russia. And I think, the silver lining will be, that the Chinese and other, friendly states of Putin, of Russia, will be telling Putin that message, right? And I think we got that from Tokayev. So hopefully, Putin will, smell the coffee, or Russians will smell the coffee and decide that there needs to be an alternative to the current trajectory. And that will either mean negotiations or a regime change scenario in Russia itself that, I think will be welcomed by most of Russia's neighbors.
Well, as you mentioned, you never know what's going to happen in Russia with the Soviet Union. No one pretty much predicted the fall of the Soviet Union, so it didn't happen until it did. And the same thing may happen with Putin's Russia, although I will just say as a closing note, knowing Russia as I do, I don't predict that the Russian people or even the oligarchs or the Siloviki are going to rise up against Russia anytime soon. I pray that they do, but I don't think they will for a while. And we're going to have to leave it there. Tim Ash, thank you again so much for your insights. And we're going to have to do this again soon. So until then, you take care.
My pleasure. Good to speak to you.
And you all also stay safe, take care, and try to stay sane.